We are excited to have Quinn Golden present The Short and Troubled Life of the KLINK. The presentation is based on the original slides and narration by Harold Gilbert and gives us a glimpse into the car that John KLINK built here in Dansville to rival Henry Ford.
So I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all. And thank you for your interest in this particular piece of Dansville's history. Can I have like one of those back on? Because yeah, I can get one. No, that's the one. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right.
Thank you. So this is an interesting piece of Dansville's history, that we had an automobile that was built here. And it was built here for about 3 years, from 1907 until 1910. But we wouldn't have any of this information if we didn't have an automotive aficionado who lived here in town named Harold Gilbert. And most of this information that I'm going to share with you tonight came from Harold. This actually is a copy of his original presentation from 1975 with his handwritten notes. And that is largely what I'm sharing with you tonight. So for the most part, this is a presentation that Harold did that I never saw from a man that I never knew. However, his presentation was on 35mm slides. So we have taken the slides with the help of Nancy Helfrich and converted them into a PowerPoint. She converted them electronically and put a PowerPoint together. But we have one thing to learn when we look for history and we try to study the past. I have a tool available to me that Harold didn't have in 1975. That's called the internet. So I was able to dig and find a great deal of accessory information to this car and the people that built it that was simply unavailable to Harold. So I've included some of that in this presentation. And as I'm going from slide to slide, every slide will fade in and fade out. But any material that I've added that is not Harold's original material, when it appears on the screen, it'll come up from the bottom. So then you know that that's a piece that I've added in with extra information that's available to us. So we have to thank Harold Gilbert for what he did, and we have to thank his wife Marilyn for what they did. Harold Gilbert was a member of the South Dansville United Methodist Church. He was a member of the Lake Erie Region Car Club, the Veterans Motor Car Club, the Livingston and Wyoming Car Club. He was a charter member of the Genesee Valley Car Club and the last founding member of the Chemung Valley Antique Car Club. He was a life member of the Antique Car Club of America. He was a member of the Horseless Carriage Gazette, the Vintage Auto Chevrolet Club of America. Harold and his best friend Walter Benedict of Canisteo were instrumental in the development and the organization of the annual AACA flea market at Hershey, Pennsylvania, which is still held to this day. We have a legacy of Harold all around us all the time. He was the author of 2 published books, one called Looking Back and one called A Book of Humorous Short Stories. Now Harold's wife Marilyn, she was a player as well. She was a retired unit clerk from the Noyes Memorial Hospital here in Dansville. She was a former den mother and a troop leader for the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scout troops. She was also active, with the Girl Scouts troop. She was a former volunteer chairman with the Livingston County and the Dansville blood drives at the Noyes Memorial Hospital. She was a life member of the Daniel Goho Post 87 Legion Ladies Auxiliary and the Frank Casbo VFW Post 6780 Ladies Auxiliary. She was also the Livingston County Legion Auxiliary, where she served in many different capacities with each group. She was a member also of the South Dansville United Methodist Church. She was a member of the Lake Erie Region Car Club, the Veterans Motors Car Club. She was a member, my screen's not on. Beg your pardon. She was a member of the Genesee Valley Car Club and the Chemung Antique Car Club as well, and a member of the Antique Car Club of America and the Vintage Chevrolet Club of America. So these two were very, very busy. And we have a great deal of what we can do and show you today as a direct thanks for Harold and his wife. So between 1907 and 1910, an automobile that was engineered and assembled and sold under the name of KLINK. And Bunnell's History of Dansville tells us that John KLINK was actually established as a photographer prior to getting into the car business. But in early automotive vernacular, the KLINK car was an assembled car. which means that they would go through a catalog and they would pull out bits and pieces and they would assemble a car and they would sell it. Engines and transmissions, frames, axles were all purchased off the shelf or purchased off the catalog. And of course the difference today is that car manufacturers, they own all their own processes. They manufacture their own engines and they do all their own stuff. But between 1895 and 1908, there was, according to Harold, hundreds of small U.S. automakers that entered the market this way. But again, I'm going to correct that because there was over 30 auto manufacturers here in western New York, in the Genesee Valley and Finger Lakes region alone. There was 30 people here building cars at that time. So an assembled car could be put together in a modest shop with basic machine tools and some good mechanical skills. And these cars were soundly built, but of course they were vulnerable to competition from larger companies. So in the beginning of the automobile, about 1893, there was more than 3,000 makes of automobiles across the country. And anywhere from 1 to 6, 8, 12, 16 different cylinders. But the KLINK was just one of many. So this car was named for its builder. He was born April 4th, 1869. Certainly not destined for fame as an automobile manufacturer. But during his lifetime, he was highly capable in another interesting field, which is photography. He was very successful as a photographer in his hometown of Dansville. The studio was on the 3rd floor of the KLINK building, which was located at 126 Main Street. And on that location right now is Leaning Tower and an office next door. So this was known as the KLINK building. And it's a little difficult to see, but here on this sign, it actually says J. KLINK Photographer. And he owned the building by this point in time. The astounding thing of that is that he was roughly 19 years old when he owned this building and set up this business. And his photography business was on the 3rd floor at the back of the building. So he bought his first car in 1903. He was enthralled with the automobile, and it was a 1903 Oldsmobile. Ransom Olds was a car manufacturer. They were building production cars. They were actually the first production car built in the country. It was actually a Model R, although it's affectionately referred to by car aficionados as a curved dash Olds. And the reason for that is the fact that this dashboard across the front is curved. And now this is officially a horseless carriage. It's not actually an automobile as we call it. Cars built up to about 1920 are referred to as horseless carriages because they looked exactly like a horse-drawn wagon, but they found a way to stuff a motor into it and drive it. And the horseless carriages had some type of a dash on the front. And the dash was not meant to hold instruments like they are today, but the dash was actually a leftover vestige from a horse-drawn carriage, in which case there was something across the front to prevent the material from the ground from flying up off the horse hooves and hitting the driver and the passenger who was going along. And of course, on a wet day on a dirt road, only some of the material was mud and some of the material was horse manure. So after driving this car for a few years, he began to think seriously of building his own automobile. Now, early in 1906, his plans crystallized when he happened to meet a young man of considerable mechanical aptitude named Charles Day. Now, we need to remember that man's name because considerable mechanical aptitude is an understatement when it comes to Charles Day. So KLINK and Day worked and they planned together for some time, and then they set out to sell stock in the KLINK Motor Car Manufacturing Company. The job wasn't easy, but the pair did it. And they got a few men interested in investing their money into this infant company. Now this is a picture of the articles of the incorporation papers. We don't have an original copy of this. All we have is just this photograph, and unfortunately it's not clear enough to be read. But these are the original incorporation papers. So they incorporated on February the 12th of 1907. It was made up of a group of local businessmen who were the original investors in the company. Fred Dreisbeck, Nicholas Ohl, Edmund Hoffman, Phil Blum, and John KLINK. And we can see their occupations in the back, that Fred was a doctor, Nicholas Ohl was a nurseryman, etc., on down. But these were not just businessmen. For example, Fred Dreisbeck was a second-generation doctor and was very successful, had a wide practice. But Nicholas Ohl, who was a nurseryman, also owned a dry goods store. And Bunnell's history tells us that his dry goods store was actually one of the best equipped and well outfitted dry goods store in Western New York. So clearly he was very successful. Edmund Hoffman owned a meat market, but he also just happened to be on the board of directors of the Merchant and Farmers Bank in Dansville. Phil Blum, obviously, of Blum Shoe Factory, also sat on the board, and he was the secretary-treasurer of the Blum Shoe Factory. And then, of course, there was John Klink. So these men were very well connected already. They knew they knew how to get things done. They sold 4,000 shares of stock for $100 per share, and then 1,000 shares if it were preferred stock, with 300 shares of common stock. And then we go on to be told that with this slim backing, the company started working on its first car on March 12, 1907. With its plant in Dansville was the vacant building which had formerly housed a chair manufacturer. It was a 2-story building, and this existed down near where the current auto auction is. Was the building there. Half of it was actually a chair manufacturer, and then half of it, 2 stories, had been converted to the auto manufacturing plant. But we got to ask a question. Now, I don't do in the stock market, but it says that they raised 4,000 shares of stock at $100 a piece. That would be $400,000 in capital, and by today's money, that would be $3.2 million. So I don't know if there's an error in that number. I don't know if I don't exactly understand what they did and whether the stock actually had cash value. I don't know. But we got to ask ourselves, why did or how does a 37-year-old John Klink photographer gain the trust of such men of local industry in order to raise and put together 1,000 shares of stock that presumably could be worth $400,000? Well, John Klink was already a success in his own right. First, he had outlasted several local photographers, right? Photography was all the rage at this point in time. It was new technology. Photographers were coming and going all the time. But guests at the Jackson Sanatorium were his primary clients, and a lot of them were very wealthy people. So they would come, go to his studio, they would have their photos taken, and eventually when they would leave and go back to where they come from, they often would write back because they'd want additional copies of the photos for other people. So he was very successful there. But he also had a substantial business in a manufacturing line under the name of the Hygienic Cereal Company. And the brand name was Hyco, H-Y-C-O, Hyco for hygienic, C-O for coffee. So he manufactured this line of product. And he also included the superior grades of tea, coffee, spices, baking powder, chocolates, cocoa, etc. And the name, the very name hygienic, obviously is a tie to the sanitarium, to the castle on the hill, with the health movement and whatnot. So it was the right name to apply to a new company, and it was the right place to build it. Now, when we want to look to see about buildings and businesses that had in the past, we can drop into the Library of Congress. And these maps are available at the Library of Congress. These are what they call the Sanborn fire maps, because this Sanborn Corporation was hired to draw maps for fire insurance companies. And every building in town was evaluated and listed and rated and described. So if we look at the Sanborn map from 1898, we can see right here that John Klink already had a factory. And this says John Klink and Son, Hyco Coffee. So this was several years and before. And it's interesting, the location of this is perfect. So this area here is what would eventually become Battle Street. And it also happens to be the exact terminus of where the canal ended, when the canal was on the road. So he purchased that land. And if we go back to the previous fire map, which is 4 years earlier, there is no building there. So that would allow us to infer that he actually bought the land, built the building, and started the business. And he was crafty enough to put it right directly beside the train station. So when people got off the train station, that was the first business they saw coming in and going out of town. And we ask ourselves, was the business successful? Well, this is the 1920 Sanborn fire map, and we see the business is still there. And in my research, I found newspaper magazine ads well into the 20s advertising the Hyco line of products. So that was a very successful company. He advertised it extensively. He usually advertised it in the form of testimonials. This is a testimonial from a reverend in Mount Morris, and he would find people to give him testimonials, and he would print them. And these would go off in papers all over the country. This particular one I found in a Georgia newspaper from 1903. So he knew how to advertise, which is kind of a conundrum, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Also, I found this ad. This was an outright nicely done ad, and it wasn't a testimonial. I actually found this in a 1900 Catholic Directory Almanac and Clerical List Quarterly. So it was a book that was published and probably sent to every Catholic diocese church across the country. And he bought advertising space in it. So he knew how to advertise, he knew how to market, and he knew how to grow a product, and he was very successful at it. So there was 15 original employees in the plant with Charles Day, again, there's that name, don't forget it, as the general superintendent, and a man named Harvey Toms was the foreman. So these were assembled cars, so all the components were purchased from the outside sources. We got the bodies. So the bodies were obtained in Buffalo. The rear end and transmission came from the Brown Light Gear Company in Syracuse. Motors came from other sources. Frames, fenders, castings, and all kinds of items were all procured from catalogs. So we think probably the timing is about right, that KLINK probably put an article or an advertisement advertising his car company in late 1906 in the Monthly Cycle and Automobile Trade Journal. Now that was the leading car magazine of the day. So he would then, after he advertised that he had a car company, he would be flooded with all kinds of letters from corporations saying, hey, we make engines, hey, we make fixtures, hey, we make this. And all of these catalogs would all come into him hoping that he would purchase those items. So KLINK and Day would then sort through all the mail. They would find the best, probably the cheapest suppliers, and they would go and they would buy the items. So these are the next few pages here. These are the types of items that were on these catalogs. So we see transmissions. You could buy transmissions, rear differentials. They weren't made for particular cars. They were just simply made and sold by catalog. Clutch forks, rear end assemblies. Transmission was $120 in this catalog. The Brown Light Gear Company in Syracuse was who this particular page was from. Brass lights. So cars of that era had brass lamps on them. A lot of things were built out of brass. The bail handle types at the top of this page were $4.90 a pair. The tail lights were $2.10 each. The larger ones on the bottom ran between $7.50 and $11 per pair. Brass speedometers. Brass speedometers were in vogue, although they were quite pricey. To get a car with a speedometer on it was a considerable upgrade. A brass speedometer sold for $20, and the types with a clock built into it was sold for $25. So that was a fairly substantial upgrade. But there was all kinds of small items to fasten upholstery, to fasten seats, to lights and entries, and just various things that all come off of these catalogs. Even your steering wheels were catalog ordered. So you could buy a steering wheel, or you could buy a steering wheel with a shaft and the steering box on the bottom of it. Steering wheels were typically made of maple at the time. A maple steering wheel with a brass spider, which is the middle of the steering wheel. That's sold for $2.65 at the time. The seats were always interesting because most every car out there used the same seats. I don't know how many styles of seat manufacturers there were, but every time you look at cars from this era, they've always got the same seats. So these front seats, the pair of seats, they sold for $43.20 a piece. Now in this picture, the back seat, the solo seat, was actually called a mother-in-law seat. You mounted that on the back, that's where the mother-in-law sat. So, and of course you needed spark plugs and all those related items. There were lots and lots of spark plug manufacturers at the time. And the magazine companies, the catalog companies, they were always pushing because they had their due as well. Since that was the only way to advertise and to get product out was through the catalogs and the magazines. This is a letter that was written from Horseless Age magazine to John KLINK, imploring him, if you have any friends that have ever bought a car or like cars, would you send us their name and we'll write them a letter and send them a free a magazine so they would subscribe to it. So the frames came from O.A. Smith Manufacture in Cleveland. Radiators were from McCord in Detroit. And a lot of the small castings were made here locally. Over here on the table, we have a number of wooden pieces. These are forms. So these aren't castings. These are actually forms. So what they would do is, as they would lay out the car, they would do the drawings, they would get in a frame, and they would know the big pieces that they had to install, a frame, transmission, rear ends, and whatnot, and they would lay it out, and this is in the design stage, and then they would take a piece of wood, and they would carve what they needed. So if they needed a handle, or if they needed a lever or whatnot, they would produce one out of wood, and they would make sure it fit in between the holes and the linkages, and then they would take all these pieces off and they would send them to a foundry, and the foundry would turn them into metal, and the foundry might do the machining, or they might do the machining themselves, and that was how they produced car parts. And they didn't typically go out and say, I want a whole year's worth of these. They would buy 1 or 2 cars worth of these. Now at that time, most of the items that were cut in the foundries were done in Smith's foundry, which was here in Dansville and would eventually become, I'm losing my mind. Foster Wheeler. Thank you. Good Lord, I missed that. And that's what happens when you shut down. So it became Foster Wheeler. So it was Sweet's Foundry. I think I said Scott. It was Sweet's Foundry, which became Foster Wheeler. And there was a couple of foundries in town at that time. But that's where a lot of these parts were all made. So he would order them off, he would have them made, and then they would all come back. Now, this is a picture of a well-known engine of the time. This was a Continental engine. Again, they sold these out of catalogs. This was an engine that Klink would use in his car eventually. But this was the Waukesha engine, another catalog order engine. This engine was used in the very first car that he made. And you'll notice on this engine, these plates with this drawbar in the middle. Hold that thought. I'm going to show you something interesting on that in a minute. So they would order these engines and from these various companies that would build them. Now, Dodge Brothers was a big engine manufacturer at the time, and Dodge Brothers actually built engines for Ford up until 1913. So a lot of these catalog engine items were out there. So Klink's first car was actually shipped on June the 7th of 1907, and it was shipped to a stockholder who was out in Los Angeles, California. And I don't know how he ever managed to hook up with a stockholder out there, but that's where the first car went to. It was priced $2,000. It was a Model 30, had the Waukesha engine in it. The engine had a 4 1/4 bore with a 4 3/4 stroke, and it developed 30 horsepower. This was a 5-passenger automobile. And there's one thing that's interesting that Mr. Gilbert makes a note of in this picture, is that generally photographers doing photography for a sales catalog are really particular about the setup and the layout. But we see on this, it looks like Mr. Klink just kind of slipped up and he just threw the top back, just kind of regardless of how it landed. So it's all just ruffled. And the metal supports and whatnot, they're not in line. The top was very nice fitting, and it would fold down very compact, and the car came with a boot. It came with a leather cover to draw over the top. And it's odd why he would have sent this off to the ad campaigns not being perfect. And that's kind of a trend in something that we see going forward. So the second Klink car was a Roadster. This was also priced at $2,000. It weighed 1,950 pounds. And the beauty of a Roadster is you had these 2 seats in the back. Now, it could have featured the mother-in-law seat. It also could have featured a small bed, like a pickup truck bed, or it could feature a delivery box. There was a number of things you could do to the back of a Roadster. So you'd unbolt the seat, you'd put something else on, and off you go. So it was a very versatile car. This picture is actually taken from their sales catalog in 1908. And it doesn't show really well here, so we're going to zoom in on it. And if you look at these inspection plates, these originally said Waukesha because it was a Waukesha motor. But Mr. Klink would bring the motors in, he would take off the inspection covers, he would send them down to Sweet's Foundry, and he would have new covers made that said on them the KLINK Motor Car Manufacturing Company of Dansville. So when you saw these pictures in the catalog, it gave the perception that they manufacture their own motors. Interesting marketing there. And this was actually very common in the day. Many makes of companies did that. So this is a copy of the first KLINK ad. This came in July of 1907 in the Automobile Trade Journal, and it was described as powerful, speedy, quiet, and handsome. So as summer of 1907 changed into fall, there wasn't a lot of reason for optimism. They had sold far less cars than they wanted to. There wasn't just a lot of market for them, or they just couldn't seem to get traction. This ad appeared in September of 1907 issue of the Automotive Trade Journal. It was advertised as a 1908, but it's a 1907. It's the same car, just advertised as a 1908. It was still priced at $2,000. Now at the bottom of this ad, which is probably a little fine to read, it says, "Will exhibit this car at Space M Grand Central Palace Show, October 24 to October 31. Now that was in New York City. And I did some additional research and I found information from this show, and sure enough, KLINK had a reserved spot for a car to be there. I saw some sources that said he brought 2 cars, but I've only been able to actually document that he brought 1 car to New York. So he actually put his automobile in a car show at the premier car show in the country, certainly on the East Coast in New York City. Now it took about 6 weeks to manufacture a car, and there was a lot of spurts at work when he had a car sold, and then if he had no car sold, there was long times of layoffs and no work for people at all. But at this time, families were larger and 7-passenger cars were all the rage. So John KLINK said, well, we need a 7-passenger car. That'll revive the company. So it was decided to add a 7-passenger car to the line. Now this was a totally different vehicle from the other KLINK. It had a Continental 4-cylinder motor rather than a Waukesha. It had a 4 3/4 inch bore with a 5-inch stroke, which produced 45 horsepower. It was an entirely new body type, entirely new frame. It was a 120-inch wheelbase frame versus the previous car that was only 111. The Model 40 had a maximum speed of 50 miles per hour. It weighed in at 2,550 pounds and was for sale at $2,650. So the first 7-passenger automobile was completed in January of 1908, and as far as we can tell, that's the only one that was ever made. Yeah, I believe it was the only one that was ever made. So according to some documentation and hearsay and opinion, this car had what they called a grabby clutch, and people didn't like it because when you would start to release the clutch, the car would grab and lurch, and there wasn't a smooth transition. On his other cars, on the Model 30 and the Model 35, they had a cone clutch, which was a different design, and it would slip very nicely. But there were virtually no complaints about the cars to anybody who owned them. They were well manufactured, they were well engineered, and they were well run. So KLINK had many good features, as evidenced by the official hill climb in Hornell, New York in 1908. So John KLINK entered 2 cars to compete down in the hill climb. Out of the 25 cars entered, 1 KLINK car came in 3rd and another came in 4th. But the 4th car was disqualified due to a technicality. So it wasn't indicated which models he sent down there, but could have been any of them because they had enough engine size and horsepower to do a good job. This ad's a little bit confusing because it shows the new Model 30 in mid-1908, but it reads under the car itself that this is a KLINK Model 30, but then all of the details describe the Model 40. Really odd. So this is the second time we see advertising that has been approved and has gone out of circulation that's not accurate, that's just not quite right. And I find that odd from a man who had already successfully business and built that business because he knew how to advertise. And these advertisings just don't make sense. It is believed that probably the Model 40 was supposed to be the car in the picture instead of this Model 30. We've never seen any actual ads for the Model 40, only in their catalog, which we believe probably that KLINK sent the wrong printing plate or approved the wrong printing plate one way or another, and that's how this happened. So with a rounded hood and a radiator and a different body, it's quite a change from the 1907 Model 30. It was a beautiful car. The Model 30 description at the top reads, "Demand has been so large that advertising has had to be discontinued." A little bit of brinksmanship there, I guess, because that's an issue. So I would call your attention one more time to the sloppy way the top looks, with the linkage bars all sticking out all over the place, the boot's not on it. It's just sloppy work for an advertising picture. Now, the new Model 30 of later in 1908 is described as being neat, natty, and stylish. Five-passenger touring car, and it was actually had a price reduction. It was sold for $1,850. So he dropped the price in order to try to get more cars out there. But months went by and the sales picture continued gloomy all through 1908. There were few buyers despite the generous equipment offered with each car. This included 2 headlamps, 2 parking lamps, a tail light, gas generator, the headlights were gas operated in those days, horn, tire pump, tire repair kit, a robe rail, a footrest, full set of tools, a top boot, and a windshield. So these were all accessories that didn't come with most cars, but the Klink was fully equipped. Trivia question: who's either old enough or enough of a car nut to know what a robe rail is? Robe rail? No? Okay, a robe rail is this thing. It hung on the back of a seat. Sometimes they were metal, sometimes they were brass or nickel plated when they started developing nickel plating. But it had a very real purpose in a car because cars were cold. Cars had no heat. Cars had that top, and that top was very frustrating to put up and put down. It took 2 or 3 guys to get the top up and down. So if it was chilly and a cold night, whoever was sitting in the back seat was in all likelihood simply going to be chilly and cold. So they developed car robes. And this was a big quilted, heavy robe with pockets in the bottom to put your feet in and straps in the top to tie it around your neck, and you could bundle up inside of that. But so that it wasn't laying around on the floor in the back of the car, a premium automobile had a robe rail so you could hang it over it. And if you were wealthy, you had a car robe, and if you were poor, you had a horse blanket. However, the same robe rail was useful for either item. Well, if things couldn't be bad enough, in 1908, Henry Ford come into the picture, and he got a hold of Klink, and he threatened to sue him out of existence for patent infringement on a spring perch. Now, a spring perch is simply a very small piece of metal that the spring eye goes around to anchor the spring to whatever it's going to be anchored to. So Henry Ford, this was enough of a concern of his that he hopped on a train, left Detroit, came all the way to Dansville to pay John Klink a visit and get to the bottom of this. And John Klink took him into the office and brought out drawings of the original 1906 Klink. Ford looked at it and said, "Yep, you designed that before I patented mine. Have a good day." And he got back in the train and he headed off back to Detroit. This is all kind of a conundrum to me. I don't doubt the veracity of the story. I'm sure the story is accurate, but this was 1908. Henry Ford had moved on. He had built 6 or 8 models of cars before the Model T in 1908, but the Model T had a totally different suspension system than the Klink or in any of the previous cars that Ford had built. The Klink cars, the springs, the leaf springs that supported the body, ran with the length of the frame. And on the Model T, they were transverse to the frame, a totally different system. Why Henry Ford felt that it was a threat is totally beyond me, but evidently he did, and here's where we come. So by 1909, 6-cylinder cars and of other makes were becoming big sellers. So John Klink said, "We can save the company. I'm going to make a 6-cylinder car." So they did. So they headed out to brighten the dismal sales record. The 6-cylinder was called a Model 35, and the motor was very much the same as the motor used in the Curtiss airplane. Now, this is a photo that was taken of a Curtiss biplane, a Curtiss airplane, that landed here in Dansville in 1911. And it landed in the field, Mr. Gilbert says, the Ames parking lot. So, but we know it was before that. Currently, it would be the Village Plaza for people that weren't here when the Ames parking lot was here, behind Tractor Supply and Big Lots. So this Curtiss airplane landed here in 1911. And you might wonder what an airplane and engine has to do with KLINK. Well, they used very much the same engine. They used the same engine from the same supplier in the next iteration of automobile. So Curtiss was experimenting with airplanes in one place, and Orville Wright was experimenting with airplanes in the other. And there just wasn't much difference between the airplane engine and the auto engine at that time. Most of the airplane engines were air-cooled, but nowhere near all of them. A lot of them had radiators on them, and they actually were water-cooled. So the new engine was built by Kirkham Brothers in Bath, New York. It had a bore and stroke of 3 3/4. Square motor, what they call a square engine, same bore as stroke, and it developed 35 to 45 horsepower. And this is the engine. So in the Kirkham Brothers engine ad folder with the specs and whatnot. So this is the original price quote. One more. Thank you. This is the original price quote from the Kirkham factory to KLINK's factory. It's dated November 17, 1908, which is in keeping. This is when he decided to build a 6-cylinder car. For a single engine, it would cost $370. In lots of 10, you could get them for $350. But I'm pretty sure that there was no way the company was geared to be able to buy 10 engines at once. It was $20 extra for an engine pre-equipped with a clutch, and they all have standard equipment, less the magneto. So the new model using this Kirkham engine had a 119-inch wheelbase. This is the brochure announcing it. And this had a 119-inch wheelbase. Bodies and most other parts were made the same as the previous Model 30, but the cars were offered in a Roadster, a Touring, and a Baby Tonneau body styles, and each was priced at $2,250. Price went up a little on those. This was the second car that was produced. This was the Roadster. This car kind of goes back to their first Model 30 of 1907. In the 1909 sales folder, when their 1908 Model 30 was actually a better looking car. So again, we have the wrong car in the wrong year for the brochure. Maybe he sent in the wrong printing plate, or maybe he just knew that the end was that near, and he was actually taking an inventory of parts that he had and trying to figure out what he could build, and then advertising that car. There's no mention of a 7-passenger model at any point in time, and very little of the 6-cylinder model. There was very little known of the 6-cylinder model, very little information. Now, in July of 1909, there was a disagreement between John KLINK and Charles Day. Charles Day, he was the head guy. He was the brains of the outfit, they said. And Day simply walked out. That was it. He was done with it. Hiram Shaw was one of the company's first employees, and he was promoted to succeed Day as a general superintendent on the floor. His wages were raised from $2 1/4 to $3 a day. Now, Hiram's son, Hubert, also worked at the KLINK plant, and it was Hubert who, several years later, would supply Harold Gilbert with most of the information that we have to share with you tonight. Now, Harold would relate how he had spent many a day cranking a hand drill, drilling holes in the frames, and then grabbing a rat tail file and scruffing out the holes until they got up to size so they could put a bolt through it to bolt whatever was on the frame. Absolutely grueling work. How you could build a car like that is kind of a question, when at the time he could have spent a little bit more money and he would have work a whole lot easier if he'd bought an electric drill. Air-cooled electric drills were developed about 1902. They had already been out by 1907, 1908. They were already pretty commonplace. Most manufacturers were using them. For a little bit more money, you could buy one custom configured to fit your frame on your automobile or whatever you were building. The second picture on the right, on the left, in the center now, actually shows a drill customized for a particular car frame. So he could have done that. So you might ask, why didn't he? Well, thanks to the internet, I think I have been able to come up with the answer. So if we look at a map of Dansville in 1909, down here we have this area, which is roughly where the auto auction is located today. So we can see the creek. We see Mill Creek coming into that area. Now, Mill Creek had several pieces cut off of it and then back into it to water power the area. So there was kind of an industrial park. There was factories down there. So if we look at that map and we look at that area and we blow it up, we actually find the original map of the KLINK factory. So this side was still the George Arndt Chair Company, and this side was the KLINK side. This was a two-story building with machining on the first floor, and assembly was done up on the second floor. But this picture gives us a heck of a clue as to why he didn't use electric drills. Because right in the middle, we have a water wheel. So a single water wheel on line shafts produced power for the furniture side and the car manufacturing side. So he could not use, there was no electricity in the building. He couldn't use or take advantage of electric drills and things that would actually save a substantial amount of labor because he was building automobiles powered by a water wheel. Now, just to keep that in context, by 1908, Henry Ford was building Model Ts. Now, Henry Ford did not have an assembly line in 1908. That wouldn't come up until a few years later. But he had figured out how to build cars with specialty teams. And the car would be in the plant. He was turning out 10 to 15 cars a day, and he would have a team of people. You're the wheel people, you're the engine people, you're the whatever people. And these teams of people would rotate, and they would build the cars, and that's how he was mass producing Model Ts. And then we had Mr. KLINK, who was working from power from a water wheel. So after KLINK and Charles Day parted, Day actually made plans to start another automobile company. He was going to start a company called the Day Messenger 6. He created some business cards. He started a business plan to do it, but it never got beyond that planning stage. And with probably the reason is that everybody knew that KLINK was a failure in the auto industry. He was not successful in it. And the idea soon died because if Charles Day was going to build a car in Dansville, KLINK had already sullied the perception that a car could be built here in Dansville. I don't know if Day was going to purchase leftover materials and parts from KLINK and go forward from there or not. Probably not, because we're going to talk about Charles Day here in just a minute, and I don't think that's the thing that he would do. Day was known to be the mechanical brains of the company. KLINK was a good mechanic with a few wild ideas, and he had some money. So, Charles Day, we got to ask ourselves, what about Charles Day? Charles Day in 1904 was drafting design gas engines with Baumbarker in Buffalo, New York. This was before he met KLINK. He was already a draftsman. In 1906, he went to Rensselaer. In 1908, he was a superintendent designing engineer of the KLINK Motor Co. So whereas we refer to him as the managing supervisor on his history and resume, he calls himself the superintendent and design engineer, which he probably was. Now in 1909, after he left KLINK, he went out to California, and Mr. Gilbert tells us that he manufactured motorcycles. But some digging, a little bit deeper digging, tells me that he actually went out and was in the motorcycle sales and repair business. But then in 1910, he designed and built and flew tractor biplanes that was powered with a motor of his own design. Now, tractor biplanes are a biplane that had the propeller in the front. Because before this time, all airplanes had the propeller in the back. They were pushers rather than pullers, puller being for tractors. In 1911, with Glenn Martin, he designed and he built pusher-type biplanes. In 1912, he owned his own airplane factory. Now, this was just 3 or 4 years after he and KLINK parted ways. He had his own airplane factory in California, designed and he built the Day Tractor airplane. He used his name on the airplanes that he manufactured. In 1913, he sold the factory, and he went and he joined Glenn Martin as the chief engineer. And I could carry this on out for every 2 years for dozens and dozens of years. The man was a mechanical aeronautical genius. His basis of starting with Glenn Martin is important because Glenn Martin Airplane Company became this company called Martin Marietta, which then morphed into Lockheed Martin, the largest aerospace company in the world. So Charles Day, you can understand why he would have got frustrated and got up one day, thrown a wrench, and walked out the door because he was building cars by water power. So this is the program of the Firemen's Convention here in Dansville of July of 1909, and this ad appeared on the back cover. Calls it a 1910, but the car is a 1909. Again, another piece of advertising that just doesn't seem to make sense. Now, about this time, this ad appeared in a motor magazine in July of 1909. It was called a 1910, and it was described as handsome, speedy, quiet, powerful, but the ads really proved just to be the final gasp of a dying company. On September 25, 1909, the plant closed its doors. In 1910, KLINK rehired Hiram and Hubert, Hiram and his son, to go down and assemble a roadster and a touring car from leftover parts that they had in stock. He thought he had a customer for them. So he hired these two guys to go and build a car. And it was just two of them, so it probably took them several months to do it. It was a six-cylinder car. And then in this letterhead, which I think is beautiful, he actually sent another letter back to Hiram, to Herbert Shaw, and he asked him to go down to the warehouse and gather up a bunch of parts, bodies, frames, various issues that they had, and ship them off to another automaker in North Carolina. So some of the inventory was sold off, went down there. But what's interesting about this letter is it's a little hard to read at the top of the letter, but the company officers have all changed. They're not the same officers. Mr. Bloom isn't even there anymore. So not only have they changed positions in some cases since they were incorporated in 1907, but Bernard Oberdorf is now taking Philip Bloom's place as the treasurer. So there must have been a lot of shifting of stock over those years. And in reading this letter, you kind of get the perception that there was a lot of parts kicking around. This very small ad appeared in the April 1910 issue of Motor magazine. Probably KLINK had hopes of selling these last two cars that they had. So they had the cars built, had the boys build them, and the deal fell through. They didn't sell, so he took out one more ad to see if anybody in the country would buy them. With practically no outside advertising and everybody locally knew the company had closed, who would buy an orphan car? So these two cars remained in storage at the factory for about 3 months. Then they were driven to a building behind the KLINK block, which would be behind the pizza place today. They sat in that building for 24 years. In 1934, they were hauled off and junked. Nobody wanted them. They had 3 miles on them. 1 mile for the test, 2 miles for the test drive. Heartbreaking. I almost sobbed. I'm a car guy. I own a Model T. I've had antique cars, and to think that two of those cars with 3 miles on them get pulled off and drank is absolutely heartbreaking. They had 3 miles on them. Actually, it was 2 miles of a test run. Every car was test drove for 2 miles, and then a mile from the factory down to the little building in back of the KLINK building. Official company records owned by Mr. Gilbert indicated that most of the KLINKs were sold locally and mainly sold to stockholders. So in 1907, 5 cars were produced. One went to this investor in California that we don't know who he was or why he was. And Doc Dreisbeck was local. He got car number 2. He was an investor. Nicholas Ull, the banker and nurseryman, he got car number 3. Car number 4 went to California. Probably another investor, but we don't know. And then John KLINK didn't even get a car until number 5 came off the line. But so all of their cars that they sold the first year actually went to investors. So they didn't even have an opportunity to sell them at full price. I'm sure there was no profit off of those. In 1908, the next car went out to O.A. Smith in Cleveland. He was the frame guy that they built the frames. The car number 7 went to McCord Radiator in Detroit. Again, these were customers. These were suppliers. So the cars were sold to investors. The cars were sold to suppliers. And at the end of the year, there was actually one incomplete car as of 1908. This is very difficult to read, obviously. This actually is a handwritten note written on a piece of brown climbing paper by Harold, one of the youngest employee of the plant, from his recollection of where all the cars went. So we know, one went to Cleveland, and that's how we know to fill the last list. This I'm going to blow this up a little bit. This is the average wages that an auto worker made in 1908. We can see that, a drill press operator made 30 cents an hour at the highest rate. A filer made 22 cents an hour, a grinder made 20 cents an hour, and to keep that kind of in some kind of scale, 24 cents an hour would be about $8.45 an hour today. So even in those days, it wasn't a lot of money. It was not, it was not a prestige job by any means. This is a list of what it cost them for parts that they bought. Again, this list came from the youngest employee who supplied a lot of this information. Body and fenders cost $167, axles cost $170, a frame cost $35, an engine cost $380, which we saw in that earlier quote. But when you add these all up together, this is a list of the major parts and pieces, but to that he still had to add a body. There's no body on this list. Upholstery, axles, front and rear. So I had the axles. He had to have a radiator, wheels, tires, lights, fenders, a top, and all that material, and the labor to put it all together. So if you add up, what we can see here for $835, and then you add in all the rest of the unknown parts and all the labor to consume it, $2,000 or $1,800 to $2,000, there's not a lot of margin in that. So this is the actual original list of the expenses that Hiram Shaw could remember that he wrote down at one point in time. Now, there are four basic factors that entered into the reason why the manufacturing company failed. For one thing, it really wasn't the car's fault. It was a really good car. At these times, there was 150 to 200 different makes of cars out on the market. However, there was 35 car manufacturers right here in western New York, between Rochester and the Finger Lakes area. So there was a lot of options to choose from. Companies like Mitchell Stoddard, Dayton, Pope, Hartfield, Garford, Pierce Arrow, some of those names would go on, but most of them would be lost to obscurity. But there's only so many suppliers of product in the United States for certain parts that went into the manufacturing of automobiles. They all ordered from the same catalogs. Everybody paid the same prices. So there was until manufacturers started making their own stuff, there was no way to save any money because everybody was paying the same rates. So basically, they're all buying from the same suppliers. KLINK did a poor job of advertising, as we've seen from examples of it, but he also only advertised in motoring trade journals. He didn't advertise in magazines that the average person would ever have passed in front of them. So only a car aficionado would actually get the trade journal and would read about it. So he did a really poor job of advertising, which is really surprising considering he was so successful at advertising in another business. These automobiles were all trade journals and motor magazines. They were read by suppliers and people that already owned cars. The name KLINK, his name, KLINK, today, that sounds a little derogatory, but that word didn't exist in common vernacular at that time. So the name didn't really mean anything. There was lots of weird names for cars. Little Buffaloes, Pungs, Finch, Brush. There was just a whole doozy of names that were out there. And the other thing was, most small towns, there just wasn't the resources here to manufacture a car. I mean, fortunately, Dansville was a manufacturing capital at the time, but nothing like there is in the cities. And you didn't have the market, people to sell the cars. Supposedly, there was only like 35 cars in all of Livingston County by 1910. So he didn't have much of a local market base. All these cars were built, put onto a train, and then shipped someplace else in the country. The automobile companies that survived the most were the ones that made most of their own parts. But even then, a good company has fallen by the wayside over the years due to competition. So today, all that remains of the KLINK Motor Car Company is wood patterns for castings, the printing plates over at the end of the table for the advertising, a few serial number plates, booklets, letters, 3 hubcaps, and some various small items. Other than that, KLINK's auto car is just another piece of automotive history. Fortunately, we have this much of history to remember it. Klink later went into dealerships, and he sold several makes of cars over the years. He sold Nash, he sold Dodge. So he continued on the rest of his life in the car business. He outlived his car companies by some 30 years. He died on November 11, 1940, at the age of 71, as he stepped out of the Star Theater between two cars and into the path of an oncoming automobile, where he was struck and killed. He actually lived for, I think, 24 hours in the hospital, and then he passed on. So ultimately, it was an automobile that finally took him out in the end. And just like the Klink, this is the end. I would be happy to field any questions that I can. I probably told you more than I already know. And if you have questions, but I'll hang out up here for a bit if you want to see the parts, have questions anyway. Yes, sir. Yes, I can. Come on. Well, should have gone back to the beginning. We've been faster. Here it is. Charles Day, Harvey Toms, Hiram Shaw, Hubert Shaw. Hubert was Hiram's son. Frank Kester, Vern Kinney. Relative? With an I? Yes, sir. Frank Hetzel, Sam White, Bill Gilder, Manny Dutton, Art Sanford, Orrin Pettibone, and Clarence. Thank you. Clarence McWhorter. Anything else? Well, thank you so much, and thank you for being interested in this, and I will hang out up here for a while if anybody has anything else before they go. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you are interested in learning about more Dansville, New York history, we have a playlist on this channel, and we are open in person from the first and third Saturdays of the month from 10 to 2. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to join our association, our email is in the description. We hope to see or hear from you soon. Have an enjoyable rest of your day.